Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com, and resident of what is probably not the best timeline ever. It's not a bad timeline as timelines go. The God Emperor is president after all, but to be honest, I would prefer to be living in a timeline where Space Bunny's dog is 100% healthy and doing really well, which jury's still out, but unfortunately not out of the woods yet. So this one is going out to all the bears in particular, because we're going to talk about some famous bears that some of you may recall from your youth. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Mandela effect. I thought the Mandela effect was absolutely nonsensical. I mean, it didn't even make any sense to me when I first heard about it some years ago. You know, it was. I remember some crazy woman talking about the fact that she remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison, and so that just seemed really odd. As a child of the 80s who was in college during the whole Sun City years and the protests and so forth, it was very bizarre to hear this, because I mean, everybody knew that Nelson Mandela was in jail and still in jail and so forth. And so anyhow, I remember hearing about that and just thinking, well, that's really kind of a bizarre thing to be thinking about. Somebody said, yes, I remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 90s. I certainly don't. I don't recall anything of the kind, and so it always seemed very strange to me. Like, well, how did that make any sense? I mean, it would have been a much bigger deal. I can remember when Winnie Mandela got in trouble because of the murder of a kid named Stompy or something like that, and she wouldn't have even been a relevant figure if Nelson Mandela hadn't been around. And so it seemed obvious to me that it was just somebody's faulty memory. But years later, I came across a reference to the Berenstain bears. And that immediately confused me. That immediately made me wonder what was going on. And so, it was very strange to think about this. And, I remember very, very distinctly that the name was Berenstein or Berenstein, spelled with spelled in the same way that Einstein was spelled. And it was bizarre to, when I saw that, I thought, did they change the name of the book? And so I went and did a Google search on it or something, and everything said Stain, Stain. And your first thought is, well, maybe I remembered it differently. Maybe I didn't recall it correctly. But that's just not possible. And the reason it's not possible is because we had I used to have, occasional arguments with people about the pronunciation of it. People were talking about the Berenstain Bears. In fact, most of the people that I knew referred to them as the Berenstein Bears. Now, that annoyed me at the time, even when I was pretty young, because I knew that the pronunciation should be Stein. At least I thought the pronunciation should be Stein. Now, obviously, I didn't know what the correct pronunciation of the person's name was. Different families have different pronunciations of the same name. But it was very, very interesting to see how people would say Berenstein, and I would tell them, well, do you call Einstein Einstein? Einstein, Einstein, and so forth. And so, why are you guys asking me about this multiple Darkstream thing? I have one Darkstream going out. There's probably a issue with the multi-streaming. It's supposed to go one to YouTube and one to stream.me. So perhaps there's an issue there, but it has nothing to do with me, and there's nothing I can do about it. So let's not waste time talking about it. But if you think about it, how would it be possible for people to mistake the pronunciation? People still call it the Berenstein Bears. I actually called a friend of mine to see what he was talking about, and to see what he remembered. Same age as I am, has a excellent memory, and I didn't even ask him, do you remember the name? Do you remember this? Whatever. And I said, I said, do you remember some children's books about a family of bears? And he said, yeah, of course. He said it was like Berenstain, something like that. And I said, Berenstein? He said, yeah, Berenstein, definitely. He said, of course I remember. It was like the family, and there were a bunch of different books, and they were all cartoons. And it was kind of interesting because the point is that this guy, who's very intelligent, who's got a very good memory, distinctly remembers it being Berenstein. Okay? So now it's possible for people to remember Berenstain incorrectly if they're pronouncing it, that way. But there's no possible way that people would remember reading Stain and call it Steen or Stein. And there's no way that I would have been correcting people, rightly or wrongly. There's no way that I would be telling people that the correct pronunciation was Stein and comparing it to Albert Einstein if it was spelled Stain. All right? That's not possible. Now, I don't subscribe to any explanation for this. I don't necessarily believe that there are different timelines. I don't necessarily believe that this is all a simulation and that we're noticing glitches. Personally, I think that if there is a rational explanation for this, the most likely one is that this is some sort of mass psychological operation that is attempting to see how far it can push people and see how far they can revise history, even within living memory, and get away with it. Now, obviously, that is conspiracy theory. In some ways, it is probably more outrageous than the idea that the moon landing was a hoax, or at least was not a accurate reflection of the real story. And so, I don't think that this is, but this is what's interesting, is that you see guys going, moon hoax, same crap, blah, blah, blah. And what I think is interesting about it is that when you look at the way that people insist on swallowing the official story, they can even go on to deny the very, very clear memories of literally thousands, tens of thousands of people. And so, I don't buy for a second the typo theory. Not a chance. And I wasn't a particular fan of the Berenstein Bears, but I have 3 younger brothers, and so we had 5, 6, 7 books, and what does tend to freak people out is when they have this very clear memory, and then they go and they dig up their old books, and it turns out that they say Berenstain. Interesting. It says apparently the Mad Poodle one is live as well as this one. So anyhow, the point is that to simply dismiss people's memories doesn't make any sense. And it's not possible, in my opinion, for that many people to remember something that incorrectly. There's an interesting. We know that memory is fallible. There's no question that memory is fallible. But you know what? So is science. So is everything. And so what you have to do is you have to look at what is more likely. You have to look at the probabilities. What is less probable? The idea that 2 people are going to misremember something, or that there's going to be a mass stealth effort to do something as minor as change the spelling of a single series of the name of a single series of books. Okay? And so what's interesting about it is that when you look at the level of I think if you're talking about just 2 people in general, that you would say, well, it's much more likely to believe that the 2 people remember things incorrectly. All right? I am pretty confident that in most cases that would be true. In this particular case, no. I know how good my own memory is. I know how good my best friend's memory is. All right? You're talking about two people with very high IQs, excellent readers, and very good memories. All right? The idea that there's any possibility that we either couldn't read the books correctly, or that we somehow got it wrong. I just simply don't believe there's any possibility of that. Especially when you look at the fact that, tens of thousands of people, have the same recollection. So now, it's kind of fun when people are, talking about glitches in the matrix and alternate timelines and all that sort of thing. And I am not absolutely precluding those possibilities. The world is a much stranger place than we understand. Reality is much stranger than we understand. But at the same time, you need to remember the concept of the big lie. What is the big lie? The big lie is not the way that Jordan Peterson describes it. It's not you lie a lot about little things and then you lie about big things. What the big lie is the idea that you will lie about something so totally outrageous that nobody can believe that you would lie about it. All right? So we know that there are parties in the world, influential parties in the world, that are aware of the big lie and utilize it. We know this for a fact, right? Everybody knows this for a complete fact. And so why is it so hard to imagine? Why is it so hard to believe that when these big lies are put into effect, for whatever reason, for science, for testing the credulity of the masses to accept alternate, revisionist fiction, why would that be in the least bit hard to believe? I mean, we're already seeing massive historical revisionism in the United States. How many times have you heard people talking about our Judeo-Christian heritage, our Judeo-Christian traditions? Okay, you understand that's not real. There's no such thing as Judeo-Christianity. There's no such thing as Judeo-Christian heritage. And there's no such thing as a mutual religious tradition that encompasses both Christianity and Judaism. You don't need to take my word for it. Go ahead and ask a rabbi. Ask him, do you worship the Christian God? They will tell you no. And so, when did that Judeo-Christian stuff start anyway? I've only heard it within the last 2 years, maybe. It actually began to be coined and utilized in the current context right after World War II. And it was part of the drive to transform the United States and pass the 1965 Naturalization Act. And so the interesting thing about it is that prior to that move to push the concept of Judeo-Christianity on Americans, and it's mostly an American thing. You very, very seldom hear it used in any other context in other countries. The interesting thing is that what Judeo-Christian actually meant was, and what it properly means, is a Jew who has converted to Christianity, an ethnic Jew who is a Christian. And so, it's very, very strange. Someone says, you know what you call a Jew who believes in Jesus? A Christian. Well, exactly. And that's why Judeo-Christian is technically redundant. So I don't see the fact that you have this attempt to revise something that dates back more than 2,000 years. At the time they began this revisionist attempt, the term had been around for 1,900 years, Christian versus Judaism. And then they suddenly start combining it. So why is it so difficult to grasp that other attempts to test the ability to push people's acceptance of revisionist history would be made? And there are probably other attempts being made. I mean, I would say that based on what we see, that it's possible to change the historical record, but it's very, very difficult. What they're finding is most people will recall what they know to be true. If you look at how resistant people are to accepting the idea that the correct spelling is stain, it's obviously very difficult. Now, of course, it's also possible that it's working the other way. Who knows? It's hard to say. But but when you look at the fact that there is a considerable amount of historical revisionism, there is a considerable amount of activity aimed at telling the big lie. To me, Occam's razor, applying logic to the situation, indicates that this Mandela effect is not an alternate timeline, that it's not a glitch in the matrix, and it's not people's memory being fallible. I believe that it is the result of a massive psychological scientific experiment. And what do you mean the other way? Well, if you think about it, it could be equally possible that it was always Berenstain all along, but it was spoken as Berenstein. That was intentionally portrayed that way. I mean, I think that's less likely because I remember, I don't think that I would have learned the name auditorily. I'm not an auditory learner. I prefer to learn through reading, and so I find it very unlikely, but that is a possible explanation. I mean, if you're going to be thinking through this stuff, then you need to be open to all the various possibilities. That's why I am at least modestly willing to entertain the theoretical possibility of, either a glitch in the matrix or, timeline shifts and all that sort of thing. I don't believe that, And so, it's very interesting to, consider these things. I mean, stuff like this changes all the time. If you look at the way that Republicans became red and Democrats blue, I think that was around 1992, perhaps. Prior to that, you would usually see usually but not always, see the Democrats being portrayed as red and the Republicans as blue. And so, but I think it's the reason it's so important to maintain an open mind about these things and not just blithely accept whatever the current narrative happens to be at the moment, is because that's how you're convinced of things that are not true. For example, many Americans are convinced that the USA is a nation of immigrants. Why are they convinced of that? Because they have been indoctrinated in it relentlessly since 1960. If you look on the blog, you can see the Google Ngram, and you can see the way that it suddenly appeared in the early 20th century and became much more utilized starting in 1960. Now the usage is now even higher, considerably higher, because they're pushing that argument on Americans. They've been doing it for a long time. But here's where it starts to become unconvincing. When you keep hearing America's a nation of immigrants, America's a nation of immigrants, and then you look at American history, there is at least some rational basis for that claim. It's not true, and it's historical revisionism, and we know why they're doing that. The melting pot, Judeo-Christianity, it's all part of the same thing. But when you start seeing the same arguments, the same narrative being pushed in Sweden, when you see the same narrative being pushed in Great Britain, when you see the same narrative being pushed in Ireland, Ireland is a nation of immigrants. Britain is a nation of immigrants. Sweden is a nation of immigrants. Then it suddenly gets it becomes less and less credible. It becomes less convincing, because as an American, you can look at American history and see where there might be a case for that. You cannot look at Swedish history. You cannot look at British history and reach the same conclusion. And so you see the limits of that revisionism. Now, I thought it was really funny, especially when you don't pay very much attention to a situation. It can be really funny when you miss something. Like, I remember when they started saying that we should call black people Afro-Americans. Do you guys remember that? Afro-American? But it's very strange when that only lasted like 9 months, I think, because there was a lot of black people didn't like it, and I remember there was a response: Afro is a hairstyle, not a race, or something like that. And so, and I almost missed. It was kind of funny because I was very aware of the Afro-American thing because I was running track at the time, and we had a number of black teammates, and so there was some discussion of whether they liked Afro-American or not. Most of them were just like, "What? We're black." I remember one guy a couple of years later getting really irritated because he was African, and he's like, "I'm not Afro, I'm not American. Why are they calling me this?" But what was interesting is that I went to Japan before the term fell out of favor. And then I came back and literally no one was saying Afro-American. Like the term had become African-American. And I remember briefly thinking, wasn't it Afro-American? You know, what happened there? Now, I don't recall ever having a discussion about it with anyone. It just became obvious to me that at some point the shift had been made. But, you know, these narrative shifts can happen surprisingly fast. They can happen surprisingly quickly. And you need to pay attention if you're going to be aware of how these narratives are imposed and utilized. So, thanks, I think. Gimli, son of Glowin, says, Vox looks great for 50. Must be his Jordanetics. Exactly. Stand up straight, take your pills, and you too can look younger than your age. Speaking of Jordanetics, paperback's out. Too late to get it for Christmas, but I would recommend it anyhow. Also, let's see. I don't have too much longer because I forgot to charge up my camera battery, so it's probably going to die pretty soon. Or not really die, but run out of juice. So I'll take a couple quick questions if anyone wants to throw some random questions at me. If you like, I can spend the rest of the time telling you how long I've thought about it and waffle and baffle garble and throw word salad at you, or I could just answer the questions. Let me know what you prefer. The the performance art of Jordanetics. Yeah, it's interesting too to see that Peterson is suddenly like acting all butch and saying that he wants to challenge people to debates and all that sort of thing. I wonder why that might be. I wonder what suddenly got him all riled up and ready to rumble. Thoughts on Mere Christianity. It's a wonderful little book. I think that every Christian should read it, and everyone who is even vaguely interested in Christianity should read it. What's your position on spanking corporal punishment? Spare the rod, spoil the child. The War Dogs audiobook is good. Great, I'm glad to hear it. We have 2 more coming out very soon. I should mention that if you're on Audible, War Dogs Inc. #1 Battlesuit Bastards is now available on Audible. Also, The Last Closet by Moira Grayland is available on the Arkhaven store. Opinion on C.S. Lewis's thesis in Abolition of Man. I've read it, but I'd have to reread it. We have a guest. This is this is one of the other dogs. Have you read Miles Mathis? Yes. I am not convinced that everybody is a CIA created fake. It's interesting. It's amusing, but let's see. You say the U.S. IQ today is 8 points lower than 1950. However, the graphs I've seen show our intelligence being up, i.e. the Finaflect. You're outdated. There's even all kinds of papers being written about trying to figure out why the Flynn effect is no longer in effect. The source for falling IQ is based on the demographic data. If you simply look at the average IQ of where the various immigrants are coming from, you can see that the US IQ has to have fallen. This is in line with actual IQ studies that have been done in Britain and in Denmark and in one other country where they test their soldiers, and they have found an IQ drop of anywhere from 7 to 11 points average. I don't have any thoughts on Yoshiki Tanaka. I don't know who that is. Does the dog know the other is sick? Yes, the dogs are very aware of that kind of thing. What are your thoughts about the core of modern capitalism, fractional reserve banking? It's a myth. The banks don't work that way. Let's see. I finished Jordanetics, gave it 5 stars. Enjoyed your brief summary of each of those 12 rules. Thank you. Thank you very much. If you have read Jordanetics, I would encourage you to review it. Working on Avalon 3. Yeah, we're done. It's being lettered. Let's see. Have you read Peter F. Hamilton? I've read like 1 or 2 of his books. They're not bad. Very dark. The Gods of the Copybook heading should be read by everyone. I totally agree. Although it's a little bit unfortunate because it's not a title that makes sense to anyone these days. Do you have an opinion on Jesse Lee Peterson? Yes, I like Jesse Lee. I respect him. I think he's a very good man. I like him enough that I did his radio show even after I had decided to stop doing media. People like to accuse people like me of hate and racism and that sort of thing, and it's kind of ironic because if you simply look at the way that I treat people, in my personal life, in my professional life, it's ludicrous. But that's the way the game is played. They aim to. It's actually related to this Mandela effect stuff because they aim to create a narrative, and it doesn't matter whether it's false or not. All that they care about is whether they can make it stick. Is Peterson acting all butch to try and protect his right flank more? Yes, without question. I mean, if you look at the accusations in the book Jordanetics, a lot of the stuff that he's been doing is clearly aimed at trying to defang that. So he's running around trying to show that he's willing to debate and all that stuff, because if he's debating a couple, people like that philosopher and so forth, it allows him to hide the fact that he's running away from his actual critics. I mean, you got to remember, everything Peterson does is in the advancement of his truth. And how does he define truth? Whatever enhances his survivability. I mean, his whole philosophy is a philosophy of mediocrity and cowardice. Isn't Berenstain a more phonetic way to spell Berenstein? No, not at all. You could have some, if people could pronounce Berenstain, Stein, stain, it's conceivable, barely, but nobody did. The pronunciations that people always used were Berenstein was the more common one, and Berenstain, which was closer to what would have been the correct pronunciation. Einstein, Berenstein. Willing to. No, of course, Peterson's not going to debate me. There's no question. He'd have to be nuts to do it. So, Shapiro's not going to do it either, because Shapiro knows me, or he at least knows me well enough to know how that's going to turn out. Is Paul Gottfried right about the Jewish question? I have no idea. I don't read Paul Gottfried. Do you meditate? No. Was Peterson abused as a child, and how? I don't know, and I don't know. But some of his behavior is certainly consistent with that possibility. Peterson had a fawning sit-down with the American Enterprise Institute the other day. Well, no, of course he did. The intellectual dark web is the new veil for the neocons. They are the new form of the neocons. It's still the same old game. It's still the same old Trotskyite game. It's still all about world revolution, globalism, and one world government. Castle. Yeah, actually, it's kind of funny. For those of you who are younger, imagine if they suddenly, like everywhere you looked, the game was Castle Wolfenstein. How convincing would you find that? Even if every Apple II emulator you dug up and every copy of the id software shareware said Wolfenstein, would you buy that? Would you believe that? I don't think so. You would have to accept to debate JBP in the 1 in a million chance he wants to, yes? I've said long ago, a long time ago, I will be happy to debate Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson. Writing, verbal, doesn't matter. So anyhow, somebody really wants to go outside, so I'm going to have to call it an evening here, but try to enjoy the timeline, enjoy the glitches in the Matrix, and I will look forward to seeing you at the next Darkstream. Have a good evening.